From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. I hate to say it, folks, summer's over. It's back to school season now, and students are heading back into the classroom. They're already there. And I just want to point out, this is the perfect time to engage them on the wonderful world of pollinators that exists all across Oregon. Now, we in the state are really blessed because arguably we have one of the nation's best farm-to-school programs, which features pollinators in a number of ways. Now, we all know how important pollinators are to Oregon agriculture, and the farm-to-school program really hits this home, and it's leading the nation and making clear what that connection is. To paint a picture of what's going on the ground, I am so pleased to have Michelle Markesteyn and Rick Sherman on the show today. Now, Michelle is the farm-to-school specialist at Oregon State University Extension, and Rick is the farm-to-child nutrition program manager at the Oregon Department of Education. In this episode, they're going to give us a crash course on the wide range of activities that happen under the farm-to-school program. Incidentally, our conversation was occasioned by them hosting me on their very own podcast, the Farm to School podcast. It is a great podcast. You're going to just hear the energy of these two folks, and it comes across in every episode. So I implore you to subscribe to the Farm to School podcast right now. But let's get into it as we head back to school this week on pollination. Okay, here we are. We are in
Jefferson, Oregon.
The metropolis of Jefferson, Oregon.
It is. I love Jefferson, and we just had a podcast. So let's to start with. Mm-hmm. We just recorded a podcast with Farm to School, and I'm here with Michelle
Markesteyn from Oregon State University,
and Rick
Sherman
from the Oregon Department of Education.
Thank you, Michelle.
We are farm school specialists for the state of Oregon.
But you're also podcast hosts.
Sure.
We are. We have a podcast that we just had you on as a guest.
World famous.
And we can put a link to that in your show notes maybe, right?
We are going to put a link to it. And I just want to say the reason why this episode sounds so good is because we're tagging along on the Farm to School's wonderful system here. Look at that. So fancy.
Or listen to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Amazing. Thank you, folks. Thanks for letting me join along. But I have been wanting to talk about the School of Farm program in Oregon. I think I screwed. How did you say it up? It's the Farm to School program.
Yeah.
Farm to School and School Gardens.
And School Gardens.
But actually, we get this all the time, and Farm to School does encompass school gardens. But when usually we bump into somebody, and that's the reason we made this our podcast, was when I bump into someone, they say, "What do you do for a living?" I go, "Oh, I'm a Farm to School analyst, actually." And they're like, "What's Farm to School?" And I go, "School gardens."
What's
and then they'll say, "Like, you mean roadies?" I'm like, no, like carrots in the ground, like edible food in the garden, and bringing local produce into the school cafeteria.
Basically, it's anything. It encompasses a whole range of
anything, like clowns.
Funny you should say that. That was my first business I ever had. My second. I was
really.
Yeah, that's a story for another day.
Listen to it. We have a podcast when I interview Michelle, and she tells about that.
But I mean, really, the whole point is, anything to within the K-12 pre-K space, things to help our farmers, fishers, hunters, gatherers, ranchers, food makers prosper. So, shared prosperity widely, and then also engage youth. So healthier eating, engage in academics, youth development, and then also just being really more part of their community. So it's a whole range of things that we say, shorthand, farm to school and school gardens. And yes, bees. We also do bees and pollination.
It's all part of it.
Well, and we'll get to that in a sec, but I think the thing that might be I think interesting in Oregon is that there's positions. So there's a position Department of Education and at Oregon State University that help coordinate this.
Well, funny you should mention that, but Michelle was the one that really was the person that created that. We were one of the first states.
Well, me and 1,000 people. I just happened to go to law school. I learned those technical skills of writing legislation. And so what we did in starting 2006, 2007, there were so many different activities already going on around the state, different school gardens here and there, but we didn't really know where they were. Schools were buying local foods, but at some point you just hit barriers. And what we realized was the barriers we were hitting were at the state level. We had some at the federal, but the most immediate thing we could change in the system was at the state level. So a whole bunch of us went to the state legislature and we're like, all right, the way that we are going to reduce barriers, increase opportunities is through pushing and pulling through the system. So have someone at the Department of Agriculture readying the supply, have someone at the Department of Education removing barriers to local procurement, and focus on the school gardens. Because it is a systems approach to behavioral change on the individual level of the youth, but then also community public health level. So...
And my understanding is this is unique to Oregon. There's a couple of other states that have kind of cottoned on to this.
Sort of like if you go to a hierarchy of farm to school leadership in each state, you can go to the National Farm to School Network and you can click on your state and you can see the people in there, and you can see that there could be a link in your show notes for the National Farm to School Network. But usually it comes down to like there's someone like in my position, a farm to school and Department of Ed person, or there's a farm to school Department of Ag person. When Michelle used to work for Department of Ag, we were the first state that had both Department of Ed and Department of Ag. So it's kind of nice. You can tag team. You could say, if somebody has a question to the Department of Ag about schools, they could send them my way. And if I get a call that says, hey, I'm a producer that wants to get food into schools, I can put it that way. But now we're the first state that has 3 positions. So,
right. So I have the first ever dedicated farm to school faculty position within an extension unit. So that's entirely what we do. And now we have this trifecta of public agencies working together, hand in glove with the private sector and community-based organizations around the state.
Okay, and this is allowing for federal funds and some federal resources to best be utilized and put to kind of solving problems on the ground. And I suppose
federal and state,
that's right. There's
local. We call it braided funding. We are braiding funding. That's what I've been calling it. I got that from Deborah John. I thought it was braided.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so you're coordinating this braided funding and resources, and maybe kind of set the stage for what are the problems that this funding is supposed to solve. Like what are on a kind of make it concrete for us. What I'm a school, students are maybe not eating the food. It doesn't reflect nutritional. Isn't highly nutritious, or what are these problems?
Let me give you an example.
Perfect. Love examples.
When I first got my job in 2012, I was at a school in Portland, and I was with the then food service director and manager, and they had a farm to school promotion going on in that they grew local kale in their school garden. And they didn't have enough to feed the whole school, so they brought in kale from their supplier, which was Cisco, right? The big truck, And so they had a display cart with, first of all, they had a kale and pear vinaigrette salad. And the thing is, if you put local, fresh, healthy food out in front of kids, they may or may not eat it, and they might see it. And we have evidence that shows that kids do try it, but if you teach them about the food, they tend to devour it. So they put it in their announcements. They put in their on their all week long in their announcements home to the folks. Their morning PA announcement. Tomorrow is kale and pear salad. We're going to eat your kale from the school garden. Every kid came up, bought a lunch, and they were eating it. Not only that, but we looked at this display and they had these unwashed bunches of kale and it was gone. We're like, what happened to that? And kids were eating it down to the stalk, the rind. And we're like, girl, who does that? But it was like, they were so excited about it. So that's kind of farm to school in essence. Like it's not enough. You want to teach the kids where their food comes from because they've lost sight of that somewhat. But not only that, but if you provide that education to it, that's where the magic happens. Right, Michelle?
Yes. And that is one example. And I'm going to give you the nerdy example. You said, what problem are we trying to solve? We have super complex, huge issues related to climate change, public health, obesity, hunger, achievement gaps in schools. And these things are so complex and no one thing is going to solve them all, right? But there are systemic approaches we can take to improve the policies, systems, and environmental contexts in which kids live. So that, you hear make the healthy choice the easy choice, make markets for producers, like all these different things that are accomplishable by serving local foods in schools and teaching kids where they come from. It sounds so simple and maybe even quaint, and it's extraordinary the potential outcomes that come in, which, is one of the reasons it's so important for Oregon State University, where you are also, to be involved, is because no one agency or organization has the mission directive or the budget to do economics, environment, community, public health, and education. So that is one thing that is different about an extension. And then that's why we work so closely with all our community partners at Department of Ed, different programs within the Department of Education. Actually, child nutrition programs is very different than the educational school outcomes, as is the social emotional learning. And then we also work with Department of Ag. And then, like I mentioned, like literally 1,000 community-based organizations around the state and commodity commissions, et cetera. So everyone actually has a piece of the farm to school puzzle. And one of our roles as state coordinators is kind of holding that container umbrella to be like, look, we do have this collective impact together. And I think kind of at the end of the day, I think of our jobs too a lot as creating shared stories and telling our shared stories of the work we do together.
That's wonderful. Amazing. I can't imagine how all of those pieces can be brought together, but it clearly needs a high level of coordination to be able to really leverage those resources and turn them into these better outcomes. And, one thing I was thinking about as you were talking, the kale story is very tangible. I can understand how providing a little bit of education on the kale and kind of like putting it in the spotlight can increase both kale production. The people who are making kale, they have a place to, they build the basis for that market in the future. People eating kale, healthiest food on the planet, I imagine.
Sure.
Yes. But in addition to that, being able to increase, people eating kale and having, making healthier food choices. And I suppose the thing that I'm most fascinated with is the way in which you're kind of providing an educational service on food in Oregon. And for me, when it comes to pollination, we think about all of the crops that are pollinated in the state. In addition to the role of bees in agriculture, this must be a huge benefit on that domain, and providing better education in terms of the role of agriculture. Give me some vignettes about how food is the food systems in Oregon are made more tangible and real for students on the ground through some of this programming, how they make those connections. I'm thinking again about the kales, like, oh, here's the kale. Kale tastes great. Here's how we can promote it, but also at the same time, having this educational content that sort of puts a spotlight on how kale's made and where it comes from.
Well, it's kind of funny because I think the way our education system is set up right now, there's not, it won't happen in a vacuum. You need something to kickstart it, I believe. And we have had, ever since I came online, we have a state grant. So we give money out for reimbursement of Oregon grown and processed food to any school district or child and adult care food program, CACFP it's called in that world, to get local food in. And so there's that. But then to teach them about it, we also have an education grant, and we probably don't have enough dollars to go around. So it's a competitive grant, but we're able to reach a lot of students. I think last biennium was like something like 250,000 students we tracked that had some sort of farm to school programming through these education grants. And they can be anything. We've done farm field trips. We've done tasting tables. A good one a few years ago was Ben Lapine did. They brought in animals. They brought in pigs and they processed them. That was the word we used, like that was more friendly, but they processed them and they used the money to get USDA inspection fees done so they could teach their FFA students how to process the pigs, and they use the meat on their food trucks for pulled pork sandwiches and stuff like that. So that's really, I mean, this example of like, here's local food, here's what it takes to process and put it on the table and everything like that. So the sky's the limit, what the people can figure out to do, and they pitch it to us, and it's scored, and we have a committee that scores them, and it's pretty competitive. We have some really good projects that don't make it in just because the scores are so high, but yeah.
And without getting overly specific, part of the request for applications, but then also we could link to your show notes if folks are really interested in that educational connection, is, research-backed or evidence-based resources. And we have more than a dozen of them, things like related to SB 13, so the tribal history and our shared history. There's 10 Gather Grow. There's Grow This or Food Hero. We also have the Oregon Harvest for Schools entire campaign and social marketing toolkits that can go to the different places within the community. So the cafeteria, the classroom, the community. There's Oregon agriculture in the classroom, and a taste of African heritage that we have available.
Okay, so all of these programs are touching various parts of both social issues, but also the production of food in Oregon. And I guess a student that is able to come through these programs will leave school when they graduate healthier, but also having some understanding about how things work. It struck me, one thing that we were talking about before we recorded was the origins of, or at least the high point of the school garden kind of movement in the Second World War, and how people might have students at the time who were part of these programs might have felt more connected to these systems, rather than thinking of themselves as like the consumer of a Twinkie, thinking of themselves in terms of, oh yeah, this is how the food is grown, and how I'm part of it, and how to think about the whole food system as something to be responsible for.
Yeah, sure. A little what kind of geek out about is, sometimes I'm overwhelmed by, oh gosh, people are so interested in school gardens, but how do we get kids more in them, and this really innovative thing we're doing? And then I look at these historical pictures from the 1900s, and you can Google this up. Just do United States School Garden Army. And it turns out that school gardens in the U.S. have ebbed and flowed over time, depending on like perceived problems, just what you asked, and then school gardens seen as a way to address those particular issues.
For the last 100 years.
Yeah, over.
Actually, World War I, yeah.
And so, World War I, II, you had over 1 million kids in school gardens producing food. It was a time that we ate more fruits and vegetables than ever or since. And then And then as that went down, we kind of waned, and we had another blip in the 70s and 80s related to environmental concerns. Rachel Carson's books came out. There was a lot of things that people were like, oh, we got to get back to the land. Mm-hmm. And then starting about 1990, 96, boom, we have been on this upward trajectory of increase in school gardens. And so many things have led to that. And to your point, it's because it's these streams of social movements related to environmental education. Now we're seeing more than ever social emotional literacy. People are like, oh, wait, we can do this in the school garden. Childhood obesity was a major thread that has led to the increase in it. And then we just have really over the last 15 years really grown the evidence base to understand that, just like we keep hearing, what you can change what kids think, know, and feel about food through the gardening, but you can't change what they eat unless it's available to them at school and home in a different way. So if you can't get that kale anywhere else other than the school garden, that's not really changing public health outcomes. So it's been a systems approach, and there's really no stopping it. The work we did in Oregon really laid the groundwork for modeling not only other states, but at the federal level with the USDA community food systems. It was modeled on a lot of the stuff we did.
And if you want to hear more about that history, we will have an episode on our Farm to School podcast coming up later this summer.
Shameless
that little plug, shameless plug. But
awesome plug.
Yeah, we're going to be interviewing an author that pretty much wrote the first book on the history of school gardens.
The amazing Rose Hayden
Smith. Yes. So that'll be later this summer. So look forward to that if you want to do a deep dive on that.
Excellent. Thanks for the plug. And I'm going to be listening to that episode. And maybe just to sort of wind things down here, I just coming back to pollinators. I think everybody has been thinking about pollinators in this episode is thinking, oh, yeah, more food and people, healthier choices. That's going to be more pollinator food, food that's pollinated by insects. But I imagine there's some brass tack questions that people have. One of which would be, I'm a honey producer in Oregon. I'd like to, participate. Or another question people I'm sure have is, well, what about bees? Can they be part of a school garden? Like, is that a possibility? What are your responses to folks on how pollinators could be woven into this whole fabric?
My response is yes. Thank you. No,
my response is go for it.
Yeah. Actually, we Michelle uses the term geeking out. I geek out on data of school gardens in Oregon. I think we were the first state to know where all of our gardens were. I actually called every school from Amity to Yoncalla in their main line and asked if they had a school garden back when the first thing I did when I got my job. And
wow.
So how
many do we have? How many
back then was 283,
and
now we're at 786.
What?
So over half of our regular public schools has
60% of the schools.
Where's the applause button?
Oh yeah,
60% of the schools in Oregon have school gardens.
So the really wonderful thing happened.
Oh.
So what that wonderful thing was it took 20 minutes a day for 3 months. So if you ever do that in another state, get an intern or two or a team. So that was probably not the way to do it, but we figured out that. And so one of the things we did is started sending out surveys to all the school garden coordinators that we knew of. And that was when our movement really started growing. Yes, it was because the farm to school movement started happening too. But I like to take credit that we actually, because figured out who the people were, boots on the ground, because what we got when we talked to them was like, I'm all alone. I don't have a network. And so we started coming to school garden summits together and stuff. But one of those questions we had was, do you have critters in the garden? Do you have chickens? Do you have bees? Do you have pollinators? What kind of bees? And so we were able to track, and I think at last count, we had like 60 schools, and I know there's a lot more now because we're going to do another survey, but 60 schools had some sort of beekeeping or pollination going on in the garden.
And there used to be a spreadsheet somewhere. I remember.
There still is.
Okay, yeah.
It's on the Oregon Department of Education's website.
Yeah, I'll give you the link for that. So, but it's out of date. I need to spend some time and do another survey. It's a daunting task to get everybody to respond, but but there's loads. I mean, I think I had like 50 questions on there. I mean, it's like, what kind of curriculum do you teach in the garden? What type does your food go into the cafeteria? Just endless questions, but it's really good data.
What about this question of a beekeeper who has honey that they want to bring into the program? How does a producer get plugged into the system?
That's a really good question. It's really easy to, like, for instance, I always look at for chickens and eggs. I do have a tab for chickens and bees in the garden on our school website. And there is a way you could do that, but you would probably have to go to the links we have for the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA. There's some rules with that stuff for processed food.
And I guess if someone, I think your question is, I have honey, I want to sell it to my local school. You literally can call up your local school, Google up the Nutrition Services Office. That's step one. And often that's where sales can be made. Mm-hmm. And they have procurement regulations, but they can work it out if it's something they want to menu. And then the second thing would be Google up Oregon Harvest for Schools directory. We have this amazing, it's almost like an online marketplace or dating kind of thing where you can put in your profile and then schools are looking there to buy products.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I thought your question was like, if you're at a school garden and you're making honey, can I sell that? Yeah. That's where you go to the USDA and we've had people do that before. Great. And you follow the rules. But to Michelle's point, like for a producer selling to schools, that's far easier because they're set up to do that.
Well, fantastic. Maybe just a quick, we do need to I have to do an episode on the Explore Bees of Oregon initiative, but this has recently, through this education grant, there's been this big push to get all fourth graders in Oregon this resource through OSU. Super
exciting. So you can Google up Food Hero Bees. That's all you need to do. And you are going to find, because of our partnership together, so many amazing resources. There is a free downloadable PDF of activity sheets, coloring pages, recipes from foods that have to be pollinated by bees, all kinds of things, even bee trading cards. If you are in fourth grade or a fourth grade teacher in Oregon, our goal at the Oregon State Department of Education, we're using a grant from them at Oregon State University, is that every fourth grade student gets a bee book. So it's kind of a neat initiative that there's lots of resources for you.
Yeah, we're going to do an episode specifically on it, but just as to touch it back to all of this, there are these initiatives have spread out into pollinators in various ways. Thanks so much for having me on your show, which was a blast. Everybody should listen, subscribe to the Farm to School podcast. But thanks for letting me use this fantastic, fancy equipment and the coffees that I've been drinking out of the fancy coffee machine.
Right. And the biscottis. Rick is a heck of a baker.
For anybody that wants to be a guest on our show, I promise to give you a latte and triple chocolate biscotti. Yeah.
I have to up my game. Anyways, thank you so much for your generosity.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.